Welcome. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world today. My name is Sarah Fee, and I'm the ROM Senior Curator of Global Fashion and Textiles at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. I'm also the lead curator for the ROM Original exhibition, Cloth That Changed the World, India's Painted and Printed Cottons. We are thrilled to let you know that the exhibit is again open to the public and will be on display now until January 2022. I'm also thrilled you could join us for today's ROM Connects. ROM Connects Lectures is generously supported by the Schmidt family. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the ROM sits on what has been the ancestral lands of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Anishinaabe Nation, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation since time immemorial to today. Today's program is in support of our exhibition, The Cloth That Changed the World, India's Painted and Printed Cottons. We would like to acknowledge the support of our Royal Exhibition Circle donors in making ROM exhibitions possible. Over the spring and summer, we have had a series of 6 talks related to the exhibit with a variety of scholars and makers, and we invite you to view them through the ROM website. So please join me. It is our great honor today to welcome today's speaker, Rosemary Krill, former senior curator for South Asia at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Her books include Indian embroidery, Marwar painting, Indian ikat textiles, chintz, Indian textiles for the West, and the fabric of India. She contributed 2 essays to the ROM's catalog, Cloth That Changed the World. Her talk today will explore an important group of South Indian textiles made in the 17th century for a South Indian ruler, possibly Tirumal Nayak of Madurai, who ruled from 1623 to 59. So what you will be looking at today are Indian painted cottons from the 17th century. These previously unknown extraordinary Kalamkari masterworks depict scenes from palace life with a Hindu ruler and ladies in a palace setting and in procession with his army. We had one of these remarkable textiles on display in Toronto as part of our exhibition when it opened in 2020, generously loaned to us by the Berge Ashtian Gallery of Paris. Now, regrettably, the export permit from France was limited, and so we had to return the panel to Paris in fall 2020. So if you happen to miss its debut in Toronto, this is the opportunity to learn much more about it. Rosemary's talk will place these panels in the context of other known Kalamkari hangings, and she will discuss the elaborate decoration of the textiles and their architectural settings, as well as the probable patron and their place of production. Now, throughout the program, you can submit questions via the Q&A function on your screen. And at the end of Rosemary's talk, we will take some time to answer your questions. So without further ado, I present Rosemary Krill. Thank you so much for joining us today, Rosemary.
Thank you, Sarah. Can you see me? Can you hear me?
We can see and hear you. So
excellent.
We'll invite you to share your screen.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sarah. And I'm just really sorry that I can't be there in person with you, and sorry that I haven't been able to see the exhibition, which looks fantastic from the images I've seen online. So the, whoops. Well, why can't I advance? I can. The textile you can see here was previously, as Sarah said, on display in the ROM's exhibition, The Cloth That Changed the World. It's one of a group of panels that came to light only a few years ago after being acquired from a French family which had reputedly owned them since their ancestor acquired them in India in the late 17th or very early 18th century. And the current exhibition was the first time that any of the panels had been on public view. So as Sarah mentioned, in this talk, I'm going to discuss 3 of the panels. I'll try to explain what they are, why their discovery was so exciting, what makes them so exceptional in their own right, how they fit into the wider South Indian tradition of Kalamkari or hand-drawn and dyed cottons, and finally, a few thoughts on the problems of identifying who they might have been made for, as well as where and when. Turning to the panels themselves, They're large cotton hangings made in the Kalamkari technique, known as chintz when exported to the West. They vary in size, especially in how wide they are in their present state, but their heights range from 151 centimeters, that's nearly 5 feet, to 173 centimeters, 5.5 feet. Some like this one have borders along the bottom edge, increasing their height. They would have been joined together to form a continuous sequence or group of sequences to be displayed around the walls of a palace or possibly a royal tent, but we don't know the original order of the pieces. They show a mixture of outdoor scenes like this one with processions of armed men and indoor scenes showing rulers, nobles and ladies of the palace. This one is one of the most dramatic panels and shows a lively procession with a ruler riding an elephant in the center, accompanied by armed soldiers or courtiers on horseback, with those at the back trying to calm their frisky horses. A row of foot soldiers with swords walks alongside them, drawn in smaller scale along the bottom of the panel. The cavalcade passes in front of an architectural backdrop of an arched colonnade hung with ropes of flowers, with pointed pavilions above, from which men and women can be seen looking out. And these include a European that you can just see in the top right, if you can see my cursor up there. Trees, birds, and monkeys fill the spaces between the pavilions. At the bottom, a border has been added with half a design of alternating dragons and medallions. From the type of architecture and the appearance of the figures in all the panels, they can be attributed to South India, and we can be more specific in identifying the main figures as belonging to a Nayaka court. The Nayakas were former governors of the Vijayanagara Empire who took control of their territories and ruled over parts of present-day Tamil Nadu from the late 16th to 18th centuries. Which of the Nayaka rulers is depicted on the panels is a question that needs to be explored, and I'll return to it later. But the Nayaka courts of Madurai and Tanjavor, here's Madurai and here's Tanjavor, are of particular significance. And as you can see, they're also very close to the so-called Coromandel coast along this southeast edge of India, the part of Southeast India where the finest hand-drawn Kalamkaris like our panels were made. In the second panels, 3 scenes show on the right, a man visiting a reclining woman. In the center, a pale-skinned bearded man, possibly a Muslim, with 4 standing women. And on the left, a man on horseback, who seems to be the same person as the main character in the first panel. In this panel, the figures are depicted directly under the arched colonnade, which are even more elaborately decorated than those in the first panel. The upper pavilions are also elaborately drawn with female figures within. This panel has no borders, possibly suggesting that it was meant to be joined to another, at least along its bottom edge. The man on horseback on the far left is clearly a person of high rank, as he's attended by 2 men, one with a fan and another with a cloth to keep away flies. His horse is richly decorated, and he carries the ceremonial floral spray or scepter called a chengol in Tamil. And I'm talking about this thing here that he's holding in front of his face, that we see in other depictions of Nayaka royal figures, like this ivory carving of an unidentified Nayaka ruler, probably from Madurai. This figure is also wearing the same style of earrings with 4 pearls, as we can see worn by the man in the textile on the left, and a similar close-fitting cap-like turban. In the third panel, 4 niches show 4 ladies surrounding a ruler on the right, and note that he's also holding the flower scepter here. Next, a woman playing with a yo-yo, and here is the yo-yo down here near the ground, with 2 attendants. Next, a bearded man, possibly the same person as in the previous panel, seated amongst 4 women, 2 of whom touch him familiarly on his right arm and leg. He holds a lotus flower in his left hand, and in the crook of his right arm perches a tame ground squirrel, which you can perhaps just see there. On the far left, the same man has stood up, put on a pair of shoes, which is very unusual for the men in these panels. Even when they're riding in procession, they're barefoot, and picked up his sword, accompanied by 2 women with less elaborate hairstyles, perhaps maids rather than courtly women. His stance is echoed by 2 men with swords in the window at the top left above him, up here. while the other pavilions are inhabited mainly by pairs of women. This piece also has no borders. All of the panels are made of 2 strips of cotton fabric stitched together horizontally, and I think you can see the join line going across the middle there. The two pieces are in most cases joined together expertly, but the fact that the design doesn't always quite match up tells us that the lengths of cloth were drawn and dyed before they were stitched together. All of the panels are done in the Kalamkari technique, the same laborious and time-consuming process that became known as chintz when exported to Europe, involving hand drawing of the outlines, hand drawing of the fine white resist that creates the white designs against a coloured background, mordanting with different substances and strengths for the various shades, many stages of dyeing for the wide range of colours, and adding final touches by applying dye directly to some areas. This includes the direct application of indigo rather than resist dyeing it, as the blue and green areas are small in size and pale in colour. You can see the small areas of blue, for example, up here in the architectural decoration. And especially here are the touches of green at the ends of the men's sashes. Although, as far as I know, no dye analysis has been carried out, the deep red background colour was almost certainly obtained from the root of the che plant, Aldenlandia umbellata, which grows in coastal southeast India and northwest Sri Lanka. The yellow would likely come from turmeric root or pomegranate rind, combined with indigo to make the few areas of green I just pointed out. The dark aubergines and purple shades would be achieved either by expertly manipulated combinations of alum and iron mordants with red dye, or perhaps by using a local dye such as the root bark of the climber Ventilago madraspatana, which gives a range of purple shades when mordanted with alum or iron. The detail of pattern and range of colour in all the panels is extraordinary, and I believe unsurpassed in Kalamkari textiles. I'm just going to show a few images to give an idea of the level of detail and variety in every aspect of the design. These 3 details of architectural settings give a sense of the intricate outlines and multiple colours used, as well as the elaborate infill decoration between the pavilions at the top, the ropes of flowers hanging from the arches, a feature also shown in South Indian paintings on paper, the intricate details of the capitals, one with Ganesh in the centre, you can see in the bottom of the bottom right detail, one with a leaping yali emerging from its base in the bottom left detail, and 2 Kirtimukha lion masks at the apex of the arches in the top detail. All of these are features that can be seen in South Indian architecture, including buildings in Madurai and Tanjavor. You can also see in these details something of the fineness of the white resist, applied with a simple bamboo pen or stick against the deep red ground. And I think you can see it very well, for example, on the yali and on the very, very fine floral decoration here. Especially striking in all the panels are the textile patterns, like this row of 7 figures, 2 male and 5 female, from the panel with the lady on the yo-yo, who we can see on the far right here. Encompassing stripes, checks, floral scrolls, and what might be an ikat pattern worn by the seated man in the center. I'm talking about this textile. These represent a snapshot of the range of textile patterns current at the time. By far the majority of the textile patterns across all the panels are geometric rather than floral. Out of around 200 figures depicted overall, I've counted only 10 wearing textiles with floral designs, including the one shown at the second right here, this black ground floral. Whoops. This imbalance reflects a preference for geometric patterns which is traditional in the south of India. Whether woven, printed, tie-dyed or ikat dyed, checks, stripes, spots and zigzags are typical of South Indian textiles. This preference for geometric patterns on textiles used for clothing was once found across more of India than just the south. It stretches back at least as far as the Ajanta paintings of the 5th century, in which the ceilings of the caves are packed with floral decoration, but the people, whether royal or commoner, male or female, are, with very few exceptions, clothed in stripes or spots. The same preponderance of geometric patterns is evident in the 16th century wall paintings at Lepakshi. Oop. Sorry, it's meant to go. Oop. Oh. Of which this is just one of many groups of figures, both human and divine, wearing a wide range of textile patterns. As Brigitte Khan Majlis has shown in her recent analysis of the textiles in the Lepakshi paintings, some of the cloths worn by sages, heroes, and nobles are flowered, while the garments of the majority of the figures, including the women's saris, have geometric patterns. Flowered textiles are certainly uncommon in our panels. These two details are their only occurrences in the three panels under discussion, but their use by high-ranking people at Nayaka courts at the same period is suggested by the painted stone sculpture depicting the renowned ruler of Madurai, Tirumal Nayak, who ruled from 1623 to 1659, on the far right here. This sculpture is one of a series of dynastic portraits in the Pudu Mandapa, which Tirumala had built in that city in 1630 to 35. The sculptor has made a prominent feature of the elaborate scrolling floral design of the ruler's wrapped garment, and it was clearly intended to be seen as a mark of high status. Some mention should also be made of the types of dress that the figures wear in our panels. Some aspects are generically South Indian, some specifically of the Nayaka period and style, while others reflect the spread of Mughal or Islamic style into this far corner of southern India. Here, for example, the bare-chested men at the lower right of this panel are wearing only tightly wrapped dhotis, a simple piece of cloth tied close to the body and between the legs to allow maximum ease of movement. Their counterparts at the lower left of this detail are rather more formally dressed, perhaps reflecting a slightly higher status. Their waistcloths are somewhat longer, and most significantly, they're worn over white tailored robes that cover most of their body. This is in fact the same as what the highest status figures, drawn to a larger scale, on horse and elephant back are wearing. This kind of robe is usually associated with the Islamic courts of North India, especially the Mughals. But by the 17th century, it was not at all unusual for Hindu men to be wearing this kind of jama or angarka, even though their territories weren't under Mughal rule. Their turbans, however, are not of the Mughal style, but are more close-fitting to the head, sometimes with a looser portion at the back, perhaps to enclose long hair, like the figure at the top right here, our main man here on the elephant. As noted earlier, this is a style particularly associated with the Nayaka courts. The man in these two panels appears twice in the piece on the right, and I think is the same person shown in the detail on the left, perhaps drawn by a different artist. This is the man who I speculated might be a Muslim. His facial hair marks him out from the main Nayaka figures, who are clean-shaven or have a thin moustache. He is depicted with white, that is undyed, skin, in contrast to theirs, which is coloured red. And he wears a different type of turban, which is much closer in style to the Mughal type. He's also one of the very few figures shown wearing shoes, as I mentioned earlier, as he is here, which could also be seen as a mark of someone from a more northerly area. He does, however, have what could be a tiny tilak mark at the bridge of his nose, which would suggest that he is a Hindu rather than a Muslim. We'll come back to him later. The women in all the panels are wearing saris, all very definitely shown with long-sleeved, tight-fitting blouses underneath. This may seem surprising. South India is often thought of as less concerned with covering up women's bodies than the North, as it is less imbued with Islamic notions of modesty. Some people have even suggested that blouse wearing was introduced by prudish Western missionaries in the 19th century, but this certainly isn't the case. And indeed, the Ajanta paintings of the 5th century show women wearing long-sleeved blouses. Until recently, rural women in many parts of India wore saris without a blouse, and this was very probably true of 17th century Tamil Nadu. It seems likely that the women in our panels are shown as dressed in a courtly style, with the appropriate additional layers of clothing. Their saris are wrapped in a fairly uniform style, with pleats in the front and the pallu end passing over the left shoulder and around the back, like you can see in the figure on the right here. The women wear a row of pearls over their hair and flower-shaped earrings and belts. All of these features can be seen in contemporary images of Nayaka women, like as in this ivory plaque in the Musée Guimet. I'd like to move on now to the place of the panels within wider textile history. Quite apart from their sheer virtuosity and drama, the excitement surrounding their discovery also relates to their age, size, and rarity. While the set may be some of the finest examples of figural kalamkaris yet to have come to light, they do belong to an already known, if very small, group of comparable pieces. Broadly speaking, textiles showing figures, whether courtly or religious, are a traditional feature of South Indian culture. They may be fairly basic types like this one, made in Madurai in the 19th century. While it's competently hand-drawn and Mordant dyed, and therefore falls into the same general category of Kalamkari as our panels, it's clearly a much less elaborate piece of work and was certainly a great deal cheaper to commission. Textiles such as these with religious subject matter relate closely to wall paintings found in South Indian temples, like this one in Tamil Nadu, with its horizontal format, narrative subject matter, and red background, all of which remind us not only of the 19th century religious hangings, but also of our group of panels. The main ways our panels diverge from others in this tradition are in the scale and complexity of their design, the virtuosity of their drawing and dyeing, and also in the fact that they depict secular figures in courtly activities, not mythical figures, gods or temples. In these respects, they are much rarer than the religious-themed kalamkaris. A further significant feature is that they're much older than most of the surviving religious hangings, dating to the 17th rather than 19th centuries. These reasons combine to make our panels a major addition to a very small and select group of luxury textiles made for secular patrons in South India in the 17th century. The piece that most closely relates to our group is this one, a fragmentary textile of which the present whereabouts are sadly unknown. The only evidence we currently have for its existence is this photograph in the V&A Museum's archives. The piece was published in the early 20th century in a Japanese journal and was probably in a Japanese collection at the time. It was subsequently discussed by John Irwin of the V&A in 1959 and more recently by Mattibel Gittinger in 1982 in the catalogue to her landmark exhibition at the Textile Museum in Washington, Master Dyers to the World. A sighting of the textile itself has not been reported for over 100 years. So although it's clearly very closely related to our panels, without physically examining it, and in the absence of any information about its history or provenance, it can shed no light on their origins. We can at least note its main features, a Nayaka prince and ladies under cusped arches with pavilions above, and a fair-skinned man, perhaps in this case a European, judging by his clothing of fitted jacket, breeches and hose, I'm talking about this gentleman here, who mysteriously reappears in Indian dress on the far left. Sorry, he's been slightly cut off by the scan, and he's even holding the ceremonial flower spray, as you see here. This piece has a narrow border, seemingly identical to the minor border on some panels of our set, on both top and bottom. We don't know the dimensions of this fragment, but it's not impossible that it comes from another panel belonging to our set. Less directly comparable, but clearly also within the same grouping, is this splendid and much published panel in the Musée Guimet, formerly in the AEDTA collection assembled by the late Krishna Ribu. Like our set, it shows multiple scenes of a Nayaka ruler in his palace and in procession, within elaborately detailed architectural settings, including cusped arches with dangling ropes of flowers. It differs in some obvious respects, for example, in having a white background rather than red. But the subject matter, the range of colours, which are now much more faded than in our panels, the rich use of pattern, especially on the textiles, and the general format of the scenes, places it in a close relationship to our set. The scale of this piece is smaller than our panels, with the height of the whole piece, 155 centimetres, around 5 feet, comprising 2 levels of the main scenes with a separating row of smaller foot soldiers, being about the height of the smallest of our pieces. The format differs from our set somewhat, as the horizontal panels are placed one on top of another, separated by a procession of swordsmen, but this may or may not have been the original configuration. Additional fragments certainly suggest that it would have been larger than it is in its present form. The original arrangement of our panels is not known, and it's possible that two horizontal panels could also have been joined one on top of the other for display. Closer in appearance in some ways to our set, but much less finely detailed in execution, is this huge hanging in a Sri Lankan temple collection. Here you can see it taken out of storage and unrolled for inspection in 2009. And even in this poor image, you can get a sense of the large scale of the figures that's very comparable to our panels, as are the red ground, architectural setting with separate scenes depicted under cusped arches, and densely patterned textiles. Some of these features can be seen more clearly in these details, such as the varied textile patterns on the right, and the use of the ceremonial floral spray held by the main character in the left image, which I hope you can see here. The 4 pearl earrings worn by the male figures also occur in our panels, as we've seen, while the circular medallion with a V motif worn by the women, like you can see here in this woman on the left, are also worn by the women in the Musée Guimet hanging. Details such as these may eventually help to identify the court or courts for which these pieces were intended. Another significant large-scale Kalamkari hanging with Nayaka figures against a red ground must also be mentioned. This striking hanging in the Tapi collection in Surat was clearly also made in Southeast India, but was found in Sulawesi in Indonesia, a known market for Indian trade textiles. This textile is narrower than our panels, 1 meter wide, as against a minimum of 1.5 meters for our panels, and very long, 7 meters, about 22 feet. These kinds of dimensions are more often found in trade cloths made specifically for export to the islands of Indonesia than for use in India itself. The end borders too, with their tiered rows of geometric patterns, are very much of the type found in trade cloths. Here is the same Kalamkari compared to a slightly smaller and earlier trade cloth in the same collection, also found in Sulawesi, also with a typical long narrow format and geometric end borders. This kind of format would only be used for saris in India itself, not for hangings or furnishing textiles. While it may seem odd that a textile that makes such specific reference to Nayaka court culture should be treasured as an heirloom cloth in Sulawesi, textiles and other trade goods frequently lose their original meanings in their new homes, where they're prized for their exotic origins, rarity and beauty, with little regard for their iconography. Even though the red ground cloth appears to have been made as an export piece rather than for an Indian patron, its recognizably Nayaka figures and its skilled use of the Kalamkari technique certainly connects it to our panels. It's drawn and coloured in a somewhat different style to our set, with stronger shading and colours reminiscent of paintings on paper, such as those attributed to Tirupati in Andhra Pradesh. The concept and design of this piece, with one continuous flow of figures, is also very different to the arrangement of our panels, with their elaborate architectural settings and discrete scenes separated by columns. While the level of detail between the two pieces may be very different, there are some notable areas of similarity. In these two details, for example, from our set on the left and the Tapi piece on the right, we see a definite correspondence between the unusual white ground fabrics with a black scrolling flower pattern on each of them. Similarly, the creases on the necks of the two figures and the heavy shading around their mouths and chin suggests a familiarity with the South Indian manuscript painting tradition. The figures in this roughly contemporary manuscript painting, for example, from a currently debated place of origin in South India, show the shading on the faces and the pronounced creases on the necks, as well as similar circular earrings to the women in the Tapi collection hanging on the right. If we look a little further afield than Kalamkaris with specifically Nayaka subjects for comparisons with our panels, we can extend the grouping to include the small number of other known examples of 17th century Kalamkaris with secular figures in an architectural setting. Foremost among these is this remarkable hanging in the Calico Museum. Measuring a huge 216 centimeters high, that's just over 7 feet, and 450 centimeters wide, 14.5 feet, this piece has the scale, the fineness of drawing, the intricately detailed textile patterns, and the architectural framing of our set. Although the onion-domed roofline and the figure's style of dress suggests an Islamic setting rather than the Hindu environment of our panels, the concept is strikingly similar, with large major figures against a red background under arches with hanging ropes of flowers, set below smaller pavilions with tiny minor figures, and lively trees and animals filling in the upper spaces between the pavilions on the skyline. There are two further hangings that were once probably joined to the calico piece, now in the V&A and the Met. And yes, these images really do reflect their respective colours. Whatever one may think about the Calico Museum's policy of keeping textiles in darkness rather than allowing public access to them, it's clearly an effective method of saving their colours from fading. The two-tiered arrangement of figures on all of these panels also recalls that of the guillemets hanging we saw earlier, once again adding to the possibility that our panels could also have been joined horizontally, perhaps with the interior scenes on top and the processions on the lower level. Although in a vertical rather than horizontal format, this well-known set of hangings, which has 7 panels in all, these are just 2 of them, in the Brooklyn Museum, also share some of the features of our panels. Using a white rather than red background, they show peoples of various parts of the world. These 2 panels show Muslims on the left and Europeans on the right, within arched niches with hanging flower garlands, with pavilions at the top in which smaller figures can be seen. As in our set, foliage and animals fill the space between the upper pavilions, although the picture is rather dark, but there are trees and animals at the top. The style of the figures and the much less detailed architecture suggests that these may have been made somewhat earlier than our panels and the others in the group. Like all the examples I've shown of this general type, there's no firm evidence of where they were made or for whom. The Brooklyn, Musée Guimet and Calico Museum hangings have all been much discussed in print, and now our set is likely to join the discussion as a major addition to this exclusive group. The Brooklyn set on the screen now has recently been the subject of an analysis by Jos Gommans, who has attributed them to the patronage of Raja Venkata II of Chandragiri, who ruled from 1586 to 1614. While this isn't the place to debate the pros and cons of that particular attribution, which was made on the basis of the cosmopolitan court culture at Chandragiri in the early 17th century, we should now turn to the problem of the dating and patronage of our set. We can start with a view of the main palace at Chandragiri, which is about 90 miles inland from Chennai, formerly Madras, and is usually attributed to the reign of Venkata II, that is the late 16th to early 17th century. Its pavilions with pyramidal towers with rounded tops are indeed reminiscent of those depicted on our panels, as we see in these 2 details. But this kind of sloping tower or gopuram continued to be used throughout South India, and stylistically this ruler is too early to be the patron of our panels. Current dating for our set is around 1640 to 50, although this is based on very indeterminate factors such as comparison with others in the group we've just seen, and ivory carvings of Nayaka figures, which also have no firm basis for their dates. One of the few firm dates we do have is that of the portrait sculpture of Tirumal Nayak of around 1630 that we saw earlier, as well as similarities with architectural features found in the Pudu Mandapa and the 1,000-pillared hall, both in Madurai. 2 pieces of our panels have been carbon-14 dated with the result of 1650 as the likely latest date. And while this method of dating isn't totally reliable as such a relatively late date, it's worth adding to the data that we have. One of the few solid facts we have to rely on is that the main characters depicted in the panels are, as we've seen, definitely Nayaka rulers and their courtiers. If we accept a mid-17th century dating for them, the main centres of Nayaka power at that time were Madurai and Tanjavor, formerly Tanjore, in present-day Tamil Nadu, and it's very likely that they were made for the ruler of one of those places. The main contenders then are Tirumal Nayak of Madurai, who ruled from 1623 to 59, Raghunatha Nayaka of Tanjavor, 1600 to 34, and his son Vijay Raghava Nayaka, 1634 to 73. All three are known for their patronage of the arts, architecture, and literature, and all would be plausible patrons of the panels. We can find parallels between the architectural details shown in the panels and real architecture in both Madurai and Tanjavor. We could cite, for example, the capitals with figures seen in the palace at Tanjavor and also on our panels. I'm talking about these figures in the capitals at Tanjavor and these small figures shown on the panels. Or columns with mythical yalis springing from them, as in the Pudu Mandapa and thousand-pillared hall in Madurai, with the pendant lotus visible in both the textile and the actual capitals. So here's the pendant lotus, here's the yali, and here they are in the textile. The Kirtimukha, or face of glory, with its distinctive bulging eyes and prominent fangs, is seen at the apex of the arches in our panels. You can see him here on the left, and also in the real architecture of Tirumal Nayak's palace in Madurai on the right. If these rather generic architectural details may not be of much use in narrowing down the patron, perhaps the individuals shown in them might be more identifiable. Even rare sculptures depicting a known person, such as this one of Tirumal Nayak in Madurai, whose lower half we saw earlier with the draped garment, are scarcely specific enough to identify with figures on the panels. Could the man on the elephant on the left be Tirumal Nayak? He has the hint of a moustache and a similar style of turban, but no doubt the same could apply to most Nayaka rulers and courtiers at the time. Images like this one supposedly represented Raghunatha Nayaka of Tanjavor, one of our other main contenders for the patronage of the panels, are even more stylized and even less helpful in identifying the main character. So specific identification of our ruler seems to be impossible so far. Returning to the intriguing bearded man, who I suggested may be a Muslim because of his fair skin, beard, and turban, it seems odd that any kind of outsider or foreigner should be given such prominence in the panels and be depicted in such close contact with the women of the court. Seeking for clues as to his possible identity, I contacted Lennart Bess of Leiden University, whose article, Sultan Among Dutchmen, Royal Dress at Court Audiences in South India, and book, The Heirs of Vijayanagara, Court Politics in Early Modern South India, I'd found very helpful in researching the panels. I asked him if he knew of any prominent Muslim ministers at any of the Nayaka courts in the 17th century, and he replied as follows, quote, I know of only one case of a Muslim holding a high office at the Nayaka court of Madurai or Tanjavor. That is Rustam Khan, Dalakartan or fort commander in Madurai, under Chokanata Nayaka in 1680 to 82. He is thought to have totally dominated the king and the court, and reportedly even had access to the royal harem. That last thing might actually explain some of the images, unquote. As you can imagine, I was quite excited by this information, but as Dr. Bess also realized, 1680 is later than the current thinking for the date of the panels. There seem to be no paintings showing Rustam Khan, so we have no idea whether or not he could be the man in the panels, nor any reliable likeness of the Madurai ruler Chokanata Nayaka, so this must remain an open question. Whoever was the patron of the panels, it seems very likely that they were mordanted and dyed at one of the Kalamkari centres on the Coromandel coast, not in Madurai, Tanjavor, or whichever of the Nayaka states they were made for. They may well have been a template for the main figures drawn by an artist used to working on paper. As we saw, elements of the figures have parallels with manuscript paintings. This would have been transferred onto the cotton cloth by the Kalamkari artists. The colours, the fantastically detailed infill designs, and the subsidiary details like the foliage and animals which run along the top of each panel could only have been created on the Coromandel coast, where the right dyes and mordants, the local water with its specific chemical properties, and essentially the dedicated and incredibly skilled Kalamkari craftsmen were to be found. This was the same community who would also be making chintz textiles for export markets for all over the world, as well as for courtly patrons all over India using the same techniques. The same deep red ground and expertly drawn details would continue to be used in the following century for the chintz hangings so beloved by the Dutch, like the one on the left here. And the lush tropical foliage around figures in architecture that runs along the top of all our panels would be reimagined in a border for a Dutch bedspread on the right. By the time these later echoes of our panels were made, they had become hybridized to suit specific foreign markets, but the skills and materials involved were the same. So we may never know exactly who the figures in our panels are, and it may not be possible to do other than speculate that their patron may have been the great Tirumal Nayak of Madurai, but their anonymous makers created some of the most brilliant artworks ever to have come out of India. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rosemary, for that incredible talk that really, I hope everyone in the audience appreciates that this is the first presentation of these findings by Rosemary, which touch upon not only the amazing textile arts of India, but also bigger art historical questions. So thank you so much for sharing it with us today. I want people to know as well that you have published a small article on your first findings related to these hangings in the Holly magazine of, I believe it was spring 2020. So we are now opening the floor to questions. Please submit them either via the Q&A or the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Another thing I wanted to thank you for, Rosemary, before we go further, is for really helping us to see the cloths, because I know the monumental scale when they were on display made it difficult for people to focus in and really see bits and pieces of it. But your talk and the details really helped us to just admire it more than ever, how beautiful and exquisite these sets of panels are. So I'm going to move us to a few questions, and as always, a lot of them are grouped around dyes and dyeing and color. So just to start with a very basic question that a few people have asked, and this is about this idea of what a mordant is, what are they, and why they matter.
Right, a mordant is a naturally occurring salt, which over who knows how many hundreds of years were discovered to fix the dye onto the cloth. Mordant means biting. So you add the mordant to the water that you're going to dye in, or sometimes it's actually painted onto the cloth itself before the textile is immersed in the dye. And the mordant combines with the dye to make it fast and also to alter the color. So it has two functions: making the dye fast and also adjusting its color. So by adjusting the mordant, you can adjust the shade.
So I think that answers a follow-up question, or a question we had from another viewer, which was, why didn't the red fade? And I think you've just answered that, because the mordant fixes it.
Yeah, well, it would, but also looking back at the slide I showed that has the Calico Museum piece next to the Met and the V&A pieces, it certainly does fade if you don't, if you expose it to light. So eventually it will fade, like all colors will fade if exposed to sunlight, but it makes it fast, i.e. it won't wash out.
One final question for now, probably others will come in, about the red. Why was that favorite color for backgrounds?
Oh, dramatic, beautiful, easily available dye. It was the kind of main local dye, so they had it there. I mean, maybe also it was, yeah, I think it was just an aesthetic preference, really.
Okay, the questions are flying in now. So somebody, another red related one. Have you ever heard of the Tanjavor root that was used in Madurai, and could that have been used for the reds? Yes,
I have, but I can't remember anything about it. But yes, worth exploring. Yes, that is a familiar word, but I can't comment, except yes, I'm sure it does exist.
A question about the skin tones on some of the court women. are they meant to depict women from different parts of India?
Are there different kind of shades of red? It could be, yeah, could be, or it could be just, you know, because people are different and they just wanted to vary how they showed people. If you have everybody looking the same shade, it's, you know, and one of the big things about these textiles is the incredible nuances of the colors. So I think partly that they just didn't want to show everybody the same color.
A question about the artists. Can you tell us a little bit more about who would have made the hangings, and would actual people have modeled for them?
The people who made the hangings would be Kalamkari, dedicated craftsmen who both drew the textile. Of course, there'd be a wide range of people who were skilled in mordanting, in dyeing, resisting. So it would have been a kind of production line. We don't know the names of any of them until the 19th century, when there are some named Kalamkari artists on some of the textiles. For example, there's a couple in the V&A from the late 19th century that have the names of the artists, but usually we don't know who they are. Could real people have modeled from them, for them in a way? I mean, that's sort of what I was also getting at, that portraiture and likenesses wasn't really something that was very widespread in 17th century South India. So real likenesses of people are very hard to achieve. So I think it was more of a generic type of woman or a type of noble who was being depicted.
I just happen to have this here. So in case anyone hasn't seen it in the exhibit or in real life, this is the pen that the Kalamkari artist used to draw the outlines, and then another variety to fill them in. So
Yeah.
that's
And
the magic tool.
Absolutely. Sometimes it's just a sharpened stick. You know, you see people just putting color on with a stick. So that the kalam would have the reservoir of the liquid, but sometimes they just needed the end of a stick.
Okay, a somewhat related question has come in, and that is, what is the relation between the genre and the artisans producing miniature paintings and Kalamkari textiles? Is there any known tie between artists or artisans?
Yeah, that's a very good point, and one we don't know enough about. I mean, I've always imagined, and I think this is the case, that the people who draw on Kalamkaris have a very different skill to the people who are drawing on paper. It's a very different process. But as I think I showed in the comparison between the pieces, the tapi piece and our set, with that Mahabharata manuscript, there are similarities. So it could be that there were, in a complex textile like this, there could have been an original drawing made by someone used to working on paper, but I think that would then have been transferred onto the cloth by a Kalamkari artist. So although they may have worked in the same court, for example, I think their skills were very different, but some of their visual effects would have been very similar.
Our exhibit, a lot of it is dedicated to the dyes and the techniques, and we seem to be getting a lot of questions on that topic today. Are any elements of any of these Kalamkari paintings actually printed? They were asking.
No, I mean, I have not examined all the panels inch by inch myself, but I am absolutely confident that there is not an inch of printing on them.
And did I understand you correctly that all of these panels would have been joined before dyeing? They were joined, painted?
No.
Each was individually dyed. Okay.
Yeah, the opposite. Sorry if I didn't make that clear. You can see sometimes where the join comes across the middle of the panel, that the pattern doesn't quite match up, and they're clearly done at two separate places, and then joined later. It would have been a huge operation. You know, an awful lot of people would have been involved in this, so that it would have been going on in different workshops and then being brought together for assembly.
All right, I'm trying to keep up with all of the questions. Here's a question, and again, we're going back to the red dyes. Is the chai root still being used today in India?
Ah, well, as Bessie Cecil was discussing in your conversation recently, sadly not. Seems to be very difficult to get chai dye now in India or indeed Sri Lanka. I mean, it's there. It's just a question of digging it up and making the dye, but it doesn't seem to be going on.
Yeah, you know, with all the revivals and innovations that are going on today, that is, it seems, still the last one to recapture is the use of that beautiful distinctive red. It looks like we just have a few more questions. And here is one. Would the scenes have been read from left to right? Do we know?
Well, the direction of all the processions is going from right to left. They're all, you know, they do tend to, and the people are tending to be facing left. So although we don't know exactly how they were disposed, I think the general flow seems to be from right to left.
And that's for each of the panels.
I just, off the top of my head, I can't think of any that are going in the other direction. Obviously, the static scenes will be more difficult to analyze in terms of if it's telling a story, because there's no kind of direction involved. But I think the ones that involve movement tend to be going from right to left.
Okay, I think we'll just give you one more question and I'll let you take a break. Can you please repeat the name of the Leiden book?
Oh, yes. It's called, is it called The Successors?
Well, I thought that was going to be an easy one. Sorry, Rosemary.
It is. I've got it written down here.
We're putting you on the spot today with all.
Yes, The Heirs of Vijayanagar.
Can you repeat that?
Heirs of Vijayanagar, Court Politics in Early Modern South India, by Lennart Bess, B-E-S.
As a way to, and I was going to actually read one of the questions that's just saying, thank you, Rosemary, for this privilege to learn so much about these pieces and to hear all of these new insights. So I echo that in thanking you for this amazing lecture, these amazing insights that have allowed me to learn even more about pieces that I have seen many times. So I thank you again, Rosemary, and I thank all of our viewers who I know have been tuning in from all around the world. I want to thank you all for supporting this program, for having tuned into this lecture and some of the past ones. And we hope to see you at further ROM online programs. So details of all these can be found on the ROM website. And for anyone who would wish to view any of the past talks, these as well are on the Cloth That Changed the World website. So we thank everyone for tuning in. We thank you again, Rosemary, and take care. And we hope to see you soon at the exhibition. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.